The woods behind the Blackthorn estate stretch for 11 miles before they hit the valley road. 11 miles of old-growth oak. Of roots that catch your feet in the dark. The ground is so cold in October it pulls the warmth straight out of your bones. I know, because I ran every single one of them. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I was not a girl who believed in monsters. I was not a girl who read about wolf packs in secret, or whispered the old stories, or looked twice when the men on the estate moved a little too fast, healed a little too clean, went quiet in ways that didn't quite fit any human explanation I'd ever been given. I was not that girl. I was the girl who kept her head down. Who refilled the water glasses and didn't make eye contact and was genuinely, pathetically grateful just to have a roof and a reason to be somewhere. That was how I survived. That was the whole strategy. Don't be seen. And for almost 2 years, it worked. For almost 2 years, I was invisible inside that estate. Staff. Background. Furniture that occasionally brought someone a cup of tea. I was never supposed to be anything more than that. He told me, much later after everything that he had been aware of me for 8 months before I ever had reason to speak to him directly. 8 months. He said his wolf had catalogued the sound of my footsteps. The specific rhythm of them. Said it could pick me out of a crowded room with his eyes closed, through walls, across the length of that enormous house. He said it like it was a confession. I think, at the time, he meant it as one. What I know now, and what I could not have possibly understood then, is that the night I'm about to tell you about was not the beginning. It only felt like the beginning. The truth is the thing had already been set in motion long before I ever heard it coming. Long before I felt the mark. Long before I understood that the alpha of the Blackthorn pack had already, in ways that defied every law his world was built on, claimed me. In secret. Without my knowledge. And for reasons that had everything to do with keeping me alive without ever intending for me to find out. I was never supposed to survive that night. That's not a guess. That's not a feeling I had. That is what they told the council. That is what was written in the order. And that is the part of this story that I need you to hold on to because everything that follows, every choice he made, every law he broke, every wall he let come down. All of it traces back to the fact that I did. The alpha claimed me in secret. I was never meant to survive it. The Blackthorn estate sits on 400 acres of inherited land in the Northern Territories. If you didn't know what it was, you might mistake it for old money. For the kind of generational wealth that stopped needing to explain itself centuries ago. The stone is real. The iron is real. The silence that hangs over the property at certain hours of the day. That is very, very real. What it actually is, what it has been for 400 years, is the seat of the Blackthorn pack. The most powerful wolf pack on the continent. And I want to be careful here, because when people hear wolf packs, they tend to reach for the version of what they were given as children. The storybook version. The cautionary tale version. Forget all of it. What I learned, over the 22 months I spent inside that estate, is that a wolf pack is not a fairy tale. It is a power structure. A layered, ancient, meticulously maintained hierarchy with rules older than any government, any court, any institution humans have ever built and consequences for breaking those rules that make human law look like a polite suggestion. At the top the alpha. One. Always one. The bloodline doesn't branch, it concentrates. Every generation, the power narrows and deepens and becomes something that the wolves below it can feel in their bones when he walks into a room. Below the alpha the betas. His lieutenants. His enforcers. The ones who translate his will into action and make sure the pack stays in formation. Below the betas the omegas. Lower-ranked wolves. Still dangerous. Still capable of things that would end a human life in under 30 seconds. But ranked. Managed. Kept in their place by the weight of the hierarchy above them. And then at the very bottom of a structure that wasn't even designed to include them. The humans. Staff. That's what they called us. Cooks. Cleaners. Errand runners. The hands that kept the estate functioning so the wolves inside it didn't have to think about mundane things like laundered sheets and prepared meals and who was going to fix the east wing boiler when it went out in January. We were useful. That was the entire sum of what we were. My name is Lyra. I was 19 when I came to Blackthorn. 21 when everything I'm about to tell you happened. I had no family. No pack. No one looking for me, no one to come if something went wrong, no one who would ask the right questions if I simply stopped existing one day. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because they knew. When the estate takes on human staff, they run checks. They find out exactly how alone you are. Exactly how invisible you are to the outside world. That's not an accident. That's a selection process. I knew what they were from the beginning. They don't hide it from the staff, there's no point. You're going to figure it out within the first week regardless. What they make very clear, very early, is the alternative to keeping quiet. So I kept quiet. I kept my head down. I did my work. I made myself as close to invisible as a breathing human being can get inside 400 acres of stone and iron and old power. And for a long time. It was enough. I need to tell you about the door. Because everything, and I mean everything that followed, can be traced back to a door I was not supposed to open on an afternoon in late September. The housekeeper had written the instructions clearly enough: west study, afternoon tray, 3 o'clock. What she had failed to mention, which I suspect she assumed was so obvious it didn't need to be said, was that the west study had been closed for a meeting. An alpha meeting. The kind where the doors stay shut and the wolves outside stand far enough away that they can't hear through them. The kind where a human with a tea tray has absolutely no business being. There were 7 of them in that room. 6 betas, the senior lieutenants of the Blackthorn Pack, men and women who had, between them, ended border disputes, negotiated territorial treaties, and done things I would only learn about much later and wish I hadn't. And him. Cale Blackthorn. I had seen him before, in the way that you see weather from inside a building. Aware of it. Affected by the atmosphere it creates. But separated from the full force of it by walls and distance and the careful management of your own proximity. This was not that. Every single wolf in that room was looking at me. And I understood, with the particular clarity that fear produces, that I had just walked into a space where my being alive was entirely a matter of someone else's discretion. He didn't move toward me. He didn't speak. He just looked. And I want to try to explain what that felt like, because I've spent a significant amount of time since then trying to find the right words for it. It wasn't threatening. That's the part that confused me most, in the moment and afterward. It wasn't the look of a predator clocking prey. It was heavier than that. More focused. The kind of attention that doesn't feel like aggression because it's operating on a frequency completely beyond it. Like being looked at by something that has already made a decision about you that has nothing to do with whether you live or die. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Then he looked away. Back to the documents. Back to the room. Back to whatever conversation I had interrupted. One hand without looking up made a single motion. Go. I stood in that corridor for a long time afterward. Tray still in my hands. Tea going cold. Trying to understand why I was still breathing. That evening, one of the senior betas found me in the kitchen. A man named Dravith. Broad. Quiet in the specific way that suggested the quiet was a choice rather than a nature. He didn't sit down. Didn't take anything to eat or drink. Just stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression I could not read. You walked into a closed meeting today, he said. I told him I hadn't known. That the housekeeper's note hadn't been specified. He was quiet for a moment. The Alpha let you leave, he said. I want you to understand that that is not a thing that happens. I told him I understood. I don't think you do, he said. So I'm going to be very clear with you. Don't mistake what happened today for mercy. Don't mistake it for indifference. Whatever it was. He stopped. Looked at me with something that, at the time, I read as warning but now understand was something closer to pity. He'll remember, he said. Alphas always remember. Then he left. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself the best thing I could do was exactly what I had always done. Keep my head down. Do my work. Be invisible. I was very, very wrong. It started small. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain it to people who weren't there. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of change that you could almost convince yourself you were imagining if the evidence didn't keep accumulating. The wolves stopped getting in my way. I know how that sounds. Like a small thing. Like nothing. But understand, for 2 years, moving through that estate had required a constant, exhausting management of their space. Step aside. Wait. Don't walk into a room if one of them is coming out. Don't take the main staircase during the morning hour when the betas use it. Manage your presence around theirs. Always. And then, quietly, without announcement, without explanation. They started doing it for me. Then the food. I came back to my room one evening, a small room, staff quarters, nothing remarkable, and there was a plate outside my door. Not kitchen food. Not the standard staff meal. Something from the main house kitchen. Something prepared carefully. Left without a note, without explanation, without any indication of who had put it there or why. I asked around. Quietly. Carefully. No one knew anything. Or more accurately, no one would say. And then I found the mark. I don't know when it appeared. That's the part that kept me awake for 3 nights in a row after I found it. I went back through my memory, trying to find a moment, a touch, a sting, a sensation that could have explained it. Something that could make it accidental. Something that could make it mean nothing. I couldn't find one. I knew what the wolves' territorial marks looked like. Staff were briefed in the first week what to recognize, what to avoid, what it meant if you ever found one somewhere it shouldn't be. This was not a territorial mark. It took me 4 days of searching through every reference I could find in the estate staff library. 4 days before I found it in a volume so old the binding had separated from the spine. An anchor mark. The passage was not long. It didn't need to be. An anchor mark, according to what I read, is not a territorial claim. It is not a warning to other wolves, not a brand, not a punishment. It is something an alpha places sometimes consciously, sometimes not, on a person their wolf has decided to keep track of. To protect. To return to. The text used a specific phrase that I read 4 times before I was willing to accept that I had understood it correctly. It said, an anchor mark is the first evidence of a bond the alpha's instinct has already recognized, whether or not the alpha's mind has yet caught up. I sat with that in the candlelight for a long time. Trying to find a different interpretation. Trying to find the version of this where a 19-year-old orphaned human girl working the kitchen rotation at the most powerful wolf pack estate on the continent had a perfectly reasonable, perfectly harmless explanation for why the alpha's mark was on her wrist. There wasn't one. The question I couldn't answer, the one that sat at the bottom of everything else and refused to move, was not how. It was not when. It was the one that mattered most, and the one that frightened me more than anything that had come before it. Why? Why would the alpha of the Blackthorn pack, cold, controlled, untouchable, leave his mark on a human girl who was never supposed to matter? I need you to understand something about wolf pack territories before I tell you what happened next. A border is not a line on a map. It is not a fence. It is not a posted sign. It is not an agreement filed somewhere in a government office that can be referenced and debated and revised over time. A border between wolf packs is a living thing. It is maintained through presence, through dominance, through the constant and deliberate communication of what will happen to anything that crosses it uninvited. The Lyra pack had been testing the Blackthorn border for 3 months before the morning they stopped testing and simply crossed it. They sent scouts first. 4 of them. Moving in the specific formation that, I would later learn, is used not for observation but for extraction. They weren't there to gather information. They were there to take something. I was in the East Garden when it happened. I know. I know exactly what you're thinking. Why were you in the East Garden when the estate had already been locked down? The answer is that no one told me. Staff were not part of the emergency protocol. Staff were assumed to be indoors, in the kitchen, in the quarters somewhere interior, somewhere manageable. I was in the East Garden because the head cook had sent me for herbs at 7:30 in the morning, and by the time the lockdown happened, I was already outside and already invisible in the way I had spent 2 years perfecting. And then one of the Veyrath scouts found me. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have replayed it many times and I still find it difficult to fully account for. The scout grabbed me. Said something in a language I didn't recognize. Another scout appeared from my left. They were communicating, deciding something quickly. And then the sound changed. I have spoken to wolves since then who were present on the Blackthorn grounds that morning. Every single one of them described the same thing. They said the alpha's shift in state was not gradual. There was no escalation. No warning. No movement through the normal stages of aggression that a wolf goes through when a threat is identified and assessed. They said he simply changed. Between one breath and the next. Between the moment the bond registered what was happening to me and the moment anyone on either side of that standoff had time to process it. The scouts released me before he reached us. That is the part one keep returning to. They released me, dropped me, stepped back, put their hands up, and they are Veyrath wolves, trained fighters. There were 4 of them. And they released me because something in what was coming toward them communicated, with complete and absolute clarity, that the negotiation was already over. He didn't speak to them. He didn't issue demands. Didn't invoke territorial law. Didn't go through any of the formal protocol that, I would learn, is supposed to govern exactly this kind of border incident. He just stood there. Between me and them. And whatever they saw in him was enough. They left. He turned around. Looked at me on the ground where I had fallen when they let go. And then he crossed the distance between us and picked me up. Now I want to be clear about this, not in the way someone lifts a person they are indifferent to. Not efficiently. Not at arm's length. He picked me up the way you handle something you have been afraid of losing. He carried me inside without a word. Set me down in one of the interior rooms. Checked me over my arms, my wrists, the side of my face where I had hit the ground with the focused attention of someone running through a list they had already had prepared in their mind. Not a scratch. I was unharmed. He stepped back. And that was when I saw it. His hands. He had tucked them against his sides by then, controlled, contained, everything about his posture, communicating the same cold authority I had always associated with him from a distance. But his hands were shaking. He left without speaking. I sat in that room for the rest of the afternoon and tried to make sense of what I had witnessed. I couldn't. He came back at midnight. I opened it. He stood in the corridor outside my quarters, not inside, not crossing the threshold in his shirt, no jacket, the formality stripped down to something almost civilian. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You need to leave this pack. Go somewhere far. I can arrange transport. Documents. Money enough to go somewhere and stay there. But it needs to be tonight." I told him no. He stood there a moment longer. Then he said, "You don't understand what you're refusing." I told him that was exactly the problem. He left. I closed the door. And I stood on the other side of it in the dark, and I listened, and I heard nothing. No footsteps walking away. He stood outside my door until dawn. I know, because I checked. I didn't sleep either. Her name was Sarah. She was the oldest wolf I had ever seen and understood. Wolves age slowly, so oldest carried a different meaning in that place. She had white hair and dark eyes and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have long since stopped being surprised by the world. She had worked in the estate's archive room for longer than any current staff member could account for. I had spoken to her perhaps 4 times in 2 years. Brief exchanges. Careful on my part, as I was careful with all of them. She found me the morning after the incident in the East Garden. She didn't open with pleasantries. She looked at my wrist, directly at it, through my sleeve, with the certainty of someone who doesn't need to see a thing to know it's there, and she said, "How long have you had it?" I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said, "Yes you do." I pulled up my sleeve. She looked at the mark for a long moment. Then she looked at me. And in the careful, measured tone of someone delivering information they know will cause damage and have decided to deliver anyway because the alternative is worse. She told me the truth. What Kale Blackthorn put on your wrist, she said, is not an anchor mark. I told her that was exactly what it looked like, based on everything I had been able to find. An anchor mark is the beginning, she said. What you have is what comes after. What comes after a very specific set of circumstances that have not occurred in this pack in over 100 years. She folded her hands on the table. He claimed you, she said. Fully. Completely. In the way that cannot be walked back. I asked her when. She told me, 4 months ago. During the blood moon in July. She explained it to me carefully. The way a person explains something to someone they need to actually understand it, not just hear it. On a blood moon, she said, an alpha's instincts reach a level of clarity that overrides conscious thought. Not violence, that's the misconception humans carry about what wolves become in those hours. Not aggression. Clarity. The deepest parts of what a wolf is the instinct, the recognition, the ancient wiring that existed before language and law and hierarchy rises to the surface and acts without waiting for permission from the mind. He was half shifted, she said. Half dreaming. His wolf knew exactly what it was doing. His conscious mind was not present enough to stop it. He chose you, she said. Without choosing. Which, in wolf law, is the most genuine form of choosing there is because it cannot be performed, and it cannot be faked, and it cannot be produced by any kind of intention or strategy. His wolf looked at everything it knew and everything it felt and it recognized you as its equal. It's a match. The one it would not release. I asked her what it meant. Practically. In terms of the bond, in terms of what it did, in terms of. She held up one hand. It means, she said, that it is the most binding connection in wolf existence. It means that it cannot be undone. It means that your lives are, in ways that are not metaphorical, threaded together. She paused. And it means, she said, that if the High Council finds out you will die. She told me the rest in the same measured tone. Alphas cannot claim humans. It is not a guideline. It is not a preference. It is a law written into the foundation of the Council's authority. The bloodline must remain uncontaminated, the power must stay within the pack structure, there are no exceptions and there have never been any exceptions. A human who carries an alpha's claiming bond is considered. She used the word contamination. Purification, Sarah said, is what they call the process of removing it. She looked at me directly. There is no process, she said. Not one that leaves you living. I asked her and my voice, I remember, was very quiet when I asked it why she was telling me this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because he has been trying to protect you since the moment he understood what happened. He has been carrying this alone for 4 months. He ordered his most trusted betas to keep you safe without telling them why. He has been looking for a way to resolve it without your knowledge, without your involvement, without the council ever finding out. She looked at me steadily. And because what happened yesterday in the East Garden, she said, means we are running out of time for him to do it quietly. I left the archive room and I walked to the far end of the estate's east wing and I sat down on the floor of an empty corridor. And I let the full weight of it arrive. He hadn't marked me to control me. He hadn't marked me to own me. He had marked me in the deepest, most involuntary, most honest act his nature was capable of because something in him had recognized something in me. And then he had spent 4 months trying to find a way to keep me alive because of it. And had told me nothing. I had approximately 1 hour to feel all of that before I decided what to do with it. I found him in his study. He was at the window when I came in standing with his back to the room, looking out at the dark estate below. He didn't turn around when the door opened. He said, you shouldn't be in this wing. I told him I had just come from Sarah. He turned around. I want to tell you that I was calm. I want to tell you that I walked in there with the measured composure of someone who had processed the information they'd been given and arrived at a rational position. That would not be accurate. You had no right, I said. To put that on me without my knowledge. Without my consent. Without. I know, he said. The 2 words landed so cleanly, so without defense, that they stopped me. I know, he said again. There is nothing I can tell you that changes that. I have been trying to undo what I can't undo. Is that why you wanted me to leave, I said. Last night. Is that why so it would be easier? To pretend I don't exist? To just remove me from the equation and manage it from a distance where you don't have to look at what you did? The silence stretched. And then he said quietly, with the particular weight of words that had been held back for a long time. No. So it would be easier, he said, to pretend that you're not going to die because of what I did. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The thing between us, the bond, the claiming, whatever name you want to give it was present in that room in a way that was almost physical. Like a third occupant. Like something that had been patient for months and was no longer willing to be ignored. He crossed the room. Stopped a few feet from me. And then he did something I had not expected. He pushed up his sleeve. It started burning, he said, the moment they touched you. He looked at it. Then at her. It has not stopped. I looked at my wrist. And then I looked at him. And I understood in a way that no amount of archive reading or explanation from Sarah could have produced what the claiming actually was. Not ownership. Not control. Recognition. 2 marks. 1 bond. Both of them lit up in a dark room, neither able to pretend the other wasn't there. I left before either of us said something that couldn't be taken back. I'm not sure that mattered. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. They arrived 4 days after the East Garden. 3 of them. Council enforcers. I didn't know what a council enforcer was before that morning. I learned quickly. They are not investigators. They are not diplomats. They are not the people the High Wolf Council sends when they want a conversation. They are the people the council sends when a decision has already been made and requires only implementation. A staff member found me in the kitchen at 6:30 and told me in the careful, neutral tone of someone trying not to show fear that I was to remain in the kitchen and not go anywhere until further notice. I stayed for 11 minutes. Then I found a position in the upper corridor where I could hear without being seen. The lead enforcer read the decree aloud. I will not reproduce the full language of it. I have tried, several times, and I find I cannot get through it without losing the composure I need to tell this story properly. The summary is this. The High Council had received information from a source within the Blackthorn Pack regarding an illegal claiming bond between the alpha Kale Blackthorn and a human female identified as Lyra, employed as staff. The bond constituted a violation of 7 distinct council laws. The human subject was to be brought before the council immediately for, and this is the word they used, the official word, the one written into the decree. Purification. The lead enforcer looked at Kale. As alpha of the Blackthorn Pack, he said, you are bound by council authority. You will surrender the human subject before nightfall. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of statement. Every beta in that hall was looking at Kale. Every one of them was very, very still. He said, give me 48 hours. The lead enforcer tilted his head. The decree. I am aware of the decree, Kale said. I am also the alpha of the most powerful pack on this continent, and I am asking you as a professional courtesy between ranked wolves for 48 hours. A pause. The enforcer looked at his colleagues. A brief communication passed between them, not in words. He looked back at Kale. 24, he said. 24, he repeated. I stayed in the upper corridor for a long time after the hall cleared. 24 hours. That is what remained between me and a death sentence with a ceremonial name. I thought about what Sarah had said. I thought about the marks glowing, mirroring, neither of them asking permission. I thought about a man standing outside my door in the dark. I thought about the hands that shook. And I understood that the next 24 hours were not going to be about what the council wanted. They were going to be about what we did before they got it. There is a structure beneath the Blackthorn estate that does not appear on any map the council has ever been given access to. It was built 200 years ago by an alpha who had, at the time, very good reasons for needing a place that powerful people could not find. I know about it because Kale took me there himself. He moved me within 3 hours of the council enforcers arriving. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself. I was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning and then, through a sequence of quiet instructions passed through a beta I had never spoken to before, I was in a passage beneath the estate that smelled of old stone and older decisions. 4 wolves came with us. I learned later that Kale had chosen them specifically, not the most powerful members of his pack, not his senior betas, not the wolves who would be most useful in a direct confrontation. He chose the ones he trusted completely. There is a difference. In a structure built on hierarchy and obligation, genuine trust is a rarer currency than power. He had been preparing it for weeks. I found that out later, and I am still not entirely sure how to hold the image of a man maintaining the outward performance of absolute control while, underneath it, quietly building an exit for someone he had never admitted to needing to protect. The 4 wolves took positions outside the passage entrance. And then it was just us. And the silence, which had always been between us as a managed thing, a professional distance, a hierarchy, a careful arrangement of who spoke and who didn't, was suddenly just silence. No roles to perform. No estate above us, no staff, no pack watching. Just 2 people in a room underground with 21 hours left on a clock neither of them had set. I asked him what the plan was. He told me there were 3 options, outlined them with the clean precision of someone who thinks in contingencies, routes out of the territory, safe houses beyond council jurisdiction, contacts in packs that had their own complicated histories with the High Council and might be persuaded to provide temporary cover. I listened. And then I said, tell me what the claim actually means. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he turned around. And for the first time since I had known him, since the tea tray and the West study and the East garden and the glowing marks and all of it, he looked at me without the alpha in the way. Just him. From a wolf perspective, he said, and his voice was different. Quieter. Be more careful. The voice of someone choosing honesty over performance. The claiming is not about possession. I know that's how humans tend to interpret it. I understand why. The language around it, claimed, bonded, marked, all of it sounds like ownership. He paused. It isn't. A wolf's claiming instinct, he said, is recognition. It's the deepest part of what we are, identifying the deepest part of what someone else is. It doesn't assess status or bloodline or what the person can offer. It doesn't calculate. It just knows. He looked at his wrist. The mark there, faint in the candlelight, steady. My wolf didn't care that you were human, he said. A pause. And then, with the simplicity of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said out loud. It only cared that you were you. I asked him, and I kept my voice level, because I needed the answer and I needed to be able to hear it clearly, why he had fought it. Why 4 months of silence? Why the plan to send me away? Why, if his wolf had recognized something real, had every visible instinct in him been pointed toward distance? He said, because loving something that can be used against you is the most dangerous thing an alpha can do. He said it without drama. Without self-pity. In the tone of someone stating a fact they have lived by for long enough that it has become architecture, something the whole structure of their life is built on. Every enemy I have, and I have many, knows that the fastest way through an alpha is not force. It is not a better army or a stronger pack. It is finding the one thing he will not sacrifice. I have spent my entire life making sure there was nothing that qualified. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. I have thought about that silence many times since. It was not uncomfortable. It was not the silence of people who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of people who have just said something real and are giving it the space it deserves before the world starts moving again. At some point I could not tell you exactly when, because time in that room had stopped behaving the way time normally does. I became aware that the distance between us was less than it had been. Not because either of us had moved dramatically. Not because anything had been announced. Just the managed space, the careful arrangement of not too close, had quietly dissolved. The marks on both our wrists were glowing. Soft. Steady. Like something that had been waiting a long time to be allowed to simply exist. I don't know what would have happened next. I know what I think would have happened. I know what the look on his face suggested was about to happen. I know that the bond between us was no longer a secret to either of us, and that, in that underground room with the world paused above us, it felt for the length of approximately 4 minutes like something that might actually be survivable. Then the sound came from above. The council enforcers did not wait for 24 hours. I want to be precise about that, because it matters not just practically, but in terms of what it tells you about the nature of the institution that sent them. They had agreed to 24 hours. They had looked at Cale Blackthorn Alpha, ranked, bound by the same wolf law they were invoking against him, and made an agreement. And then they moved at hour 9. Because they had never intended to honor it. The 24 hours was not a concession. It was positioning. It was the time they needed to locate where he had moved me and organize a breach. Cale gave a single instruction to the wolves with us, one word, quiet, absolute, and then he looked at me. Stay behind me, he said. Whatever you see. Whatever happens. Behind me. I told him yes. I meant it. What followed was not the kind of confrontation that resolves neatly. I will not pretend I can give you a clean account of it, because I was not in a position to observe it cleanly. I was behind Cale, I was in a confined space, and I was, for approximately 90 seconds, more frightened than I have ever been in my life. What I can tell you is what I felt. And what I felt, from the moment the enforcers entered that room, was the bond. It had been glowing before. A presence. Something warm and persistent that she was becoming accustomed to. This was different. This was the bond responding to his state, to the threat, to the full activation of everything. The alpha was in a moment where he was no longer managing it for anyone's comfort. It moved through her like a current. Like something that had been waiting at the edge of her awareness her entire time in that estate, and had now been given a situation that finally warranted its full arrival. One of the enforcers got past him. It happened in the space of a second, a deliberate tactic, one wolf drawing Cale's attention while another moved around the edge of the room. He was reaching for me before I had fully registered. He was there. And I did the only thing I could think to do. I accepted the bond. I don't know if I can explain what that means in terms that translate cleanly. It was not a decision in the way that most decisions are, a weighing of options, a rational assessment, a chosen course. It was more fundamental than that. It was the part of me that had been standing at the edge of something for months that had felt the pull of it and kept stepping back, kept finding reasons, kept maintaining the careful distance of someone who is afraid of what happens if they stop maintaining it. It simply stopped stepping back. It moved through her body like nothing she had ever felt. Speed she did not own. Strength that was not hers alone. The clarity of the bond, his senses, his awareness, his read of the room flowing through the connection between them like water through a channel that had always been there and had only now been opened. She moved. The enforcer did not reach her. They got out. I want to be honest, it was not elegant. It was not a clean escape. 2 of the wolves Cale brought with them were injured. One enforcer nearly had her by the ankle on the stairs. But they got out. Cale was looking at her. Even breathing hard, even with the aftermath of the fight still written across him, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the alpha assessing a situation. Not the controlled man managing his responses. Something raw. Something that the last 90 seconds had stripped every layer of composure away from and had not yet been rebuilt. You accepted the bond, he said. Not an accusation. Not a question, exactly. The words of someone who had believed, somewhere underneath everything, that she wouldn't. That she would find a reason not to. That the gap between what the bond was and what the world would let it be would be reason enough to keep the door closed. I said, I didn't want to die. A beat. Then, quieter, the part that was harder to say, the part that had been true for longer than the last 90 seconds. And I didn't want you to either. We stayed in the tree lean until we were both breathing normally. Then he said, I need to tell you something. I told him I thought we had established a precedent for honesty. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The ghost of something that, under different circumstances, in a different life, might have been easy. There is one option, he said, that I didn't put on the table earlier. He invoked the right of the claimed at sunrise. I want to explain what that is, because most wolves alive today have never seen it used. Most of them believed it was a historical artifact, a right so old and so specific in its conditions that it had, for practical purposes, ceased to exist as a real option. It had not ceased to exist. It had simply been waiting for the right alpha to remember it. The right of the claims is written into the foundation of wolf law, older than the council itself, older than the current hierarchy, older than almost every structure that currently governs wolf society. It states, in essence, this. If an alpha invokes a claim that has been contested, the claim, regardless of species, regardless of rank, regardless of any other consideration, has the right to prove the bond's legitimacy through trial. Not through argument. Not through testimony. Not through any process of bureaucratic review. Through a trial of the council's own design. If the claim survives, the bond stands. Permanently. Uncontestably. Beyond the reach of any law that currently exists or could be written. The lead enforcer said, the right of the claimed applies to wolf-born mates. The subject is human. There is no precedent. There is no exclusion, Kale said. His voice is absolutely level. The voice of someone who has read the law more carefully than the people currently attempting to use it against him. Find me the exclusion, he said. Read me the line. Show me the specific language. The right of the claimed does not exclude humans. Because when it was written, the wolves who wrote it did not consider the possibility that an alpha would claim one. They had not written the exclusion because they had not imagined the need for it. And in wolf law I would learn this later, with a satisfaction I will not apologize for. An exclusion that was not written does not exist. The enforcers conferred for 11 minutes. Then the lead enforcer looked at Kale. Then he looked at me. Then he said, the council will convene the trial. Kale turned to me. We had talked about this in the tree lean, in the dark, in the afterquiet of the ambush. He had laid it out with the same clean precision he brought to everything, the options, the odds, what the trial would likely involve, what surviving it would mean, what failing it would mean. He had not dressed it up. If she failed, the council's sentence stood. There would be no further appeal, no further rights to invoke, no further options. She would die. If she survived, the bond was legitimate. Recognized. Written into wolf law in a way that could not be challenged, revised, or circumvented. They would be his word untouchable. He said, you don't have to do this. He said, there are still routes out. I can still get you beyond council jurisdiction. It's not the same as surviving this, but it's. I told him to stop. I want to tell you why I said yes. And I want to be honest about it, not the romantic version, not the version where it was purely about him or purely about love or purely about the bond and what it meant. The honest version is this. I had spent my entire life being someone who was not supposed to matter. Invisible by design. Invisible by necessity. The girl who kept her head down and managed her presence and was grateful. Remember, I used that word early on, and I meant it just to have a reason to be somewhere. I had survived by making myself small enough that nothing could get a grip on me. And somewhere in the last 24 hours, in an archive room, in a dark corridor, in an underground room with candles and maps and a man saying things he had never said to anyone, I had become aware that small was no longer something I was willing to be. I was tired. I was tired of surviving in secret. I was tired of existing in the margins of a world that had decided, without asking me, that I didn't qualify for a place in it. And I was tired most of all, most specifically, with a clarity that surprised me with its force. Of being something that someone had to hide. I told Kale yes. He looked at me for a long moment. And then quietly, in a voice that contained everything he had spent 4 months not saying, he said. Then we do this together. The trial was set for 3 days hence. I had 3 days to prepare for something that had, by design, never been survived by a human before. I had 3 days to become something that the High Wolf Council had decided, before I was born, that I was not allowed to be. Seat. 3 days after Kale invoked the right of the claimed, in a chamber that had stood for 4 centuries, before 7 council members who had between them presided over more wolf law than most packs would encounter in a generation. I walked in. I want to be careful about how I describe what follows. Not because I want to protect you from it. But because the trial was designed deliberately, specifically, with the full weight of 400 years of council experience in breaking people to resist description. It was designed to be the kind of thing that, if you survived it, you would find difficult to put into language that other people could fully hold. I will do my best. There were 3 parts. The first was psychological. They put me in a room with nothing. No light. No sound. No sensation of time passing. Just the inside of my own mind. For long enough that the inside of my own mind became the only thing that existed. I want to tell you I handled it with grace. What I can tell you honestly is that I handled it. I had spent 21 years learning to exist in spaces where I was not wanted, not seen, not acknowledged as mattering. I had spent 21 years being alone in rooms metaphorically, sometimes literally, and finding a way to remain myself inside them. The council designed the first trial to break people through isolation. They had not accounted for someone who had already learned, through necessity, that isolation could not take anything from you that you didn't hand it. And underneath the dark, the bond. Steady. Present. Not rescuing her, not intervening, just there. The way a hand feels in yours, not because it is pulling you somewhere but simply because it is holding on. She was not alone in the dark. She had never, she understood in that room, been alone since July. The second was physical. I will not detail the specifics not because they are too painful to recount, but because the specific mechanics of it matter less than what is required to get through. What it required was not strength. Not wolf strength, not the borrowed power of the bond, not anything that could be measured in terms of force or speed or any physical metric the council had built the trial around. What it required was the decision made once, and then made again to keep going when the rational assessment of the situation suggested that stopping was the more reasonable option. The bond moved through her in the moments when the decision was hardest. Not a flood. Not a sudden infusion of something supernatural that removed the difficulty. More like a reminder. A current running alongside her own will, not replacing it, not overriding it. Reinforcing it. The way it feels to do something hard and become aware, in the middle of doing it, that someone is watching who believes you can. She felt him. Through the connection. Not his words, there were no words. Just his presence. Unwavering. Constant. On the other side of the bond, like a fixed point she could orient herself around when everything else was moving. The third was the one the council believed was the most certain. It was a spiritual test and an assessment of the bond itself. A determination of whether what existed between Lyra and Kale was genuine, or performed, or a fabrication of circumstance. The council's instrument for this, an elder wolf of significant age and ability, specifically trained in the reading of bonds, placed her hands on Lyra's mark and read what was there. The reading lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, the elder wolf opened her eyes. She looked at the 7 council members. And she said in the carrying voice of someone delivering a finding she had not expected to deliver, from someone who had come into the room fully prepared to find fabrication, she said. The bond is genuine. It is complete. It is the oldest, cleanest claim I have read in 40 years of this work. She paused. And it is in every measurable quality mutual. The head of the council looked at Lyra for a long moment. Then he looked at the decree on the table in front of him, the one that said purification, the one with the ceremonial language and the irrevocable sentence. He turned it over. I have been asked, many times since, what that moment felt like. Walking out of those doors. I find it difficult to answer, not because the feeling wasn't there but because it was so many things at once: relief, and exhaustion, and something that I think was only then beginning to understand itself as pride, that reducing it to a single description always feels like a misrepresentation. What I remember most clearly is not what I felt. It is what I saw. There was a beta in the 3rd row who had, 8 months ago, stepped aside in a corridor for a human staff member without knowing why. He was looking at her now with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and recognition. He knew. They had all been responding to the bond. 4 months. Without knowing it. Without being told. The pack instinct, flowing outward from their alpha, the most deeply embedded directional force a wolf can feel, had been quietly, consistently, without announcement or explanation, telling them all the same thing. She is to be protected. She matters. Make room. Their alpha's bond had been chosen well. Every single one of them, in their own small way, had already known it. He found me sitting by the window. I had been there for perhaps an hour. Just sitting. Letting the last 3 days settle into my body in whatever way they needed to. There is a particular exhaustion that follows survival. Not the exhaustion of effort, though that was present too. The exhaustion of having held yourself together through something that required everything you had, and only now being in a place safe enough to put it down. He came in without knocking. He had stopped knocking at some point in the last 72 hours and neither of us had commented on it. He sat down across from her. We stayed like that for a while without speaking. It was easy. That was the thing, I kept noticing how easy the silence had become between us. It had started as a managed thing, a careful professional distance maintained through effort. It has become, somewhere in the last 3 days, the silence of people who are comfortable enough with each other that words are optional. Then he said, "Can I tell you something?" I told him that seemed to be what we were doing now. That almost smile again. Closer to the real thing this time. He said, "I have been trying to find the right way to say this since July." I told him he had my attention. He looked at the mark on his wrist for a moment. Then at hers. Then at her. And then he said in the quiet, careful voice of someone finally giving language to something that has lived in them without language for a long time. "I claimed you because you were the only person in 100 years who walked through this estate and wasn't afraid of me. Everyone who comes through those gates is afraid of me. Staff. Wolves. Diplomats. Rivals. Everyone performs a version of not afraid. Some of them are very good at the performance, but I have been alpha long enough to know the difference between someone managing their fear and someone who genuinely doesn't have it." He paused. "You were afraid," he said. "I want to be clear that you were afraid. But you were afraid for yourself. Afraid of the situation. Afraid of the estate and what it was and what could happen to you inside it. A beat. You were not afraid of me. My wolf noticed it the first week you were here," he said. I didn't understand what it was noticing. I told myself it was irrelevant. I told myself a great many things over the following months that I no longer believe. He looked at her directly. "On the blood moon in July," he said, "my wolf stopped listening to any of them. It thought," he said, and something in his voice shifted softer, more private, the voice of someone quoting something they have held close for a long time, "that a person who could walk through everything this place is, everything I am, and find their own fear but not find fear of me." He stopped. Then, simply. My wolf thought that was the bravest thing it had ever seen. Not a small laugh. Not a polite one. The kind of laugh that arrives when the alternative is crying and the body makes a decision without consulting the mind first. She laughed, and then she was crying, and then she was doing both simultaneously in the specific way that happens when you have held too much for too long and someone says the exact thing that opens the valve. The marks on both their wrists glowed. Not urgently. Not in response to threat or distance or the activation of something desperate. Just warmly. Steadily. The way something glows when it has been a secret for a long time and has finally, at the end of a very long road, been allowed to simply be what it is. I looked at him. And I thought about the girl who had come through the gate 2 years ago with nothing and no one and a strategy built entirely around not being seen. I thought about everything. It had taken the mark, the secret, the East Garden, the underground room, the ambush, the chamber, the trial to arrive at a room this quiet. And I thought, worth it. Not without cost. Not without damage. Not without the particular reconfiguration that happens to a person when they go through something that requires everything. But it was worth it. We stayed in that room until the light went completely. And neither of us said anything else for a long time. Because some things, once they have been said, don't need to be followed by anything. They only needed to be said. One of the betas entered. He was carrying a sealed letter. The seal was not Blackthorn. It was not counsel. It was not any insignia she recognized from her 2 years inside this world. He handed it to Kale. Kale looked at the seal for a moment and something moved across his face. Not the open warmth of the last hour. Something older. Something more guarded. He looked up at the beta. When did this arrive? An hour ago, the beta said. Carried by a runner from the Ashveil Pack. They said it was urgent. Kale opened it. Read it. The room, which had been the quietest and warmest it had been in days, changed. Not dramatically. Not with any outward display. But she had learned, over the last 72 hours, to read the things that happened to him that didn't announce themselves. The slight tension in the jaw. The stillness that was no longer comfortable but operational. The way his eyes, when he looked up from the letter and found hers, carried something that had not been in them a moment ago. What is it? She said. He held the letter for a moment. Then he set it on the table between them, face up, so she could read it. The Ashveil Pack. An alpha she had never heard of, from a territory so far north it barely appeared on the estate's maps. Writing to inform the Blackthorn Alpha formally, officially, with the specific legal language of a wolf making a documented claim that there existed, within their records, evidence of a bond mark connecting their alpha to a human female matching her description. A mark, the letter stated, that had been recorded in Ashveil Pack archives. Recorded before July. Before the blood moon. Before any of this. A mark that predated Kale's. She looked up at Kale. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has just had a very good evening interrupted by the specific kind of news that doesn't have a clean response. The room which had been a place of resolution, of things finally settled, of a story finally given its proper ending, was no longer that. I have been asked in the time since whether I was afraid when I read that letter. The honest answer is that I was something more specific than afraid. I was the person who had just survived a trial designed by the most powerful wolf institution on the continent. I was the person the alpha of the Blackthorn Pack had chosen, in the deepest and most involuntary act of recognition his nature was capable of. I was the person who had spent 21 years being invisible and had decided, 3 days ago, that she was finished with that. A second mark. A pack I had never heard of. An alpha whose name I did not know. A record that predated everything I had just survived. I looked at Kale. And I said, tell me about the Ashveil Pack. But that is a secret for another night. If you made it to the end of this. Thank you. Not in the way you thank someone for sitting through something. In the way you thank someone for staying. For following it all the way to the part where it gets complicated again. Because that's the thing about these stories. They don't end clean. They end at the next door. The question is always just, are you willing to open it? What do you think is behind the Ashveil Pack's claim? Drop your theories below. Like if you need part 2. Subscribe so you don't miss it.